If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, this is Wayne Callan for Attitude Magazine, and welcome to today's webinar. I wanted to let you know that this webinar is sponsored by Camp Sequoia, focused on the unique talents of twice exceptional young men. Directed by Brian Lux and based upon his research presented at the World Gifted Conference, Camp Sequoia empowers success in young men through innovative and dynamic programs. From 3D printing and astronomy to traditional campfires, art, and sports, Camp Sequoia provides individual attention to bring out the best in all of their campers. Campers enjoy air-conditioned semi-private lodging, lounges, and a 2-to-5 staffing ratio for their summer of fun. You can visit Camp Sequoia online at www.camp-sequoia.com. Today's webinar topic, ADHD and Gifted, Helping Twice Exceptional Kids Succeed, is a challenge many of us want to meet because, after all, we want our kids to be happy and to unlock their talents and gifts in school and life. We are very fortunate to have Diane M. Kennedy and Rebecca Banks-Cull, authors of the book Bright Not Broken, Why Twice Exceptional Children Are Stuck and How to Help Them. Diane and Rebecca are also the authors of the ADHD Autism Connection and co-founders of the Bright Not Broken Lorna Wing Institute of America. Diane is the mother of 3 twice exceptional sons. Rebecca is mom to 2 twice exceptional children. Diane and Rebecca will give an introduction about 2E kids and how they get stuck in school. Then they will take your questions. If you want to ask a question, type it in the Ask the Question box. Welcome, Diane and Rebecca. Very good to have you here today.
Thank you, Wayne. We appreciate it. We came to our mission and founding the Bright Not Broken Lorna Wing Institute because in our culture, giftedness is too often tied to achievement in school and in life, while the psychological gifts are often misdiagnosed as disability. Too often, we think the emphasis is upon the child's challenges instead of upon the strength, so that we believe that when the whole child's missed, the outcome can be really devastating, educationally, socially, and vocationally. It affects the whole life outcome. And socially, it can lead to just bullying, misunderstanding, isolation, while educationally our children can fall through the cracks, which also impacts their vocational opportunities.
This is Diane Kennedy. That was Rebecca, and we are so excited to be here today to talk to you about this topic and something that we want to emphasize as we highlight how we're really going to break down this information and get through as much as we can today. And, of course, we will refer you to our book, Bright Not Broken, where all of the information we're talking about today is expanded in depth. And we're looking forward to the questions today as well. As Rebecca pointed out, our mission, and it really is an expansion of our mission that we've done in our work for so very long, and that is to understand basically these 3 concepts, to understand who they are. What are we talking about as far as who is an exceptional, a twice exceptional child, who is a gifted child, who is a child with disabilities and giftedness. That's who they are, and that is important. But our really want to point out where we are a little bit different and where we really have seen a need, an underserved explanation is why they're stuck. And we hope to give you just a firm grasp on that today. And by understanding the importance of why they're stuck, and by that importance of understanding, it also allows you and illuminates a much better way to help them and direct where the best therapies and interventions are when you truly have a grasp of who they are and understand why they're stuck. So let's begin by understanding who they are and defining what is giftedness. Like the gifted expert that we refer to quite often, Dr. Linda Silverman, who's the founder of the Gifted Development Center, we too believe that giftedness is a psychological reality that must be separated from the myth of achievement. I'd like to point out that giftedness is an experience of being an outsider, of feeling that you know you're very different from the norm, as we call it. And also a really important point is that giftedness can be observed in these young children at a very early age. I know myself with my youngest son, Sam, who we speak often about, who sort of led me to this mission. We notice signs of giftedness and advanced development at a very early age before we really begin to see some of the struggles of his twice exceptionality emerge. So it's important, if you understand what giftedness is, you might identify these characteristics at a young age and recognize what they are in terms of giftedness, rather than what happens often is the disabilities are looked at as they begin to emerge if they also accompany the giftedness. Giftedness leads us to a set of issues that are very unique to this population. And as I mentioned, it does require early intervention and identification because that allows things to sort of get on the right track from the get-go. So it's an important concept that needs to be understood about what makes giftedness. It creates a qualitatively different life experience. So we want to understand what it is from the beginning. And with that, next slide, I'm going to let Rebecca talk about giftedness in Dabrowski's theory.
All right. And while we can see traits of giftedness early on, I also want people to understand that traits of disability can also be seen in very young children, and so that sometimes parents aren't certain what they're seeing. Dabrowski is a Polish psychologist, and his theory accounts just marvelously for both sides, the gifted and twice exceptional, the giftedness and the disabilities or challenges as well. His theory came out of personality development and disintegration, and as experts in giftedness kind of latched onto it, especially these concepts of overexcitabilities, they began to see that these areas explains where each individual personality may be drawn, which can lead to gifts and talents and high functioning, but it can also lead, when they're drawn out to just extremes, also lead to disability. When you think, for instance, sensual overexcitabilities can lead to sensory integration problems very quickly when they're carried to one extreme, even as they can also lead to artistry and artistic abilities to the other.
What is twice exceptional? What do we mean by that term? It is that giftedness can co-occur with one or more developmental or learning disorders. And we focus very much on autism and ADHD, autistic spectrum disorder, Asperger's syndrome. But I want to point out also that this can include other conditions such as bipolar, OCD, and we also want to make sure that we understand many of these things come into play. But the most important thing to know about twice exceptionality is that the giftedness can mask the disability, or the disability can mask the giftedness, and most importantly, the two can cancel each other out and neither one gets fully recognized.
Traits of twice exceptionality are here on this slide, but I want to focus on a couple of them. First, the asynchronous uneven development. oftentimes our children will develop intellectually, emotionally, socially at different paces. And so that when we see a gifted child, a young child who's highly curious or emotionally sensitive, and we recognize that they have these abilities, at the same time, other aspects of development lag behind. For instance, while we have the intellectually capable child who's very inquisitive, emotionally or socially, they may lag behind their peers in development, so that we get this kind of confusing mix of strengths and challenges. We also see unevenness, especially as moms and in the classroom. A lot of times we see unevenness in skills and abilities. While they may have a strong ability or a skill in one area, say mathematics, executive functioning or working memory issues may cause them a lot of challenges in the language arts classroom. We can see the organizational challenges with executive functioning issues. The working memory also impacts organization, so that in addition to these challenges, specific learning disabilities kind of hide the giftedness, so that the focus becomes on the child's inability a lot of times not to function in an environment rather than upon what they can do. So this leads to a lot of challenges in the classroom, a lot of challenges socially, because while a child may be able to carry on a conversation about their area of interest, dinosaurs or video games, and go on about this at a high level, when they start talking to their friends and monopolizing the confusion, that can lead to some serious social challenges in peer groups. So these are some traits of twice exceptional children.
I'd like to move on to the next slide where we talk about and expand on those traits, and that is they can be a confusing mix. And as you can see on your screen, we've got a whole slew of them here, and it's really this is where the struggle comes in, that the strengths that we see and the perplexity of understanding these individuals is they can be creative and very innovative, but they can also have poor social skills and have a difficult time relating, which allows them to not fit in. We hear so often that it's one of the biggest depressive conditions with these children is that they feel so out of sorts that they're not understood and they don't fit in. Yet they are very exuberant about their strengths. They have advanced problem-solving abilities. They're insightful. They have in-depth interests. They're very, very curious and inquisitive. That's something that's really important. You might have a child from the time they could speak, they are a why child. I know for myself, all of my children actually, I nicknamed them the why children because they were always full of questions. It's a nonstop curiosity. And that curiosity can also be a challenge in that it makes them very perfectionistic in that they really have got to know all of the answers, which of course is not always possible. So it becomes a challenge. They're very committed in the last one is really significant. They are highly knowledgeable and very passionate in their areas of special interest. So with that, we see sometimes that maybe this child, we see signs of what we might think is attention deficit disorder because they have difficulty paying attention, yet we see that complexity, and I know other experts in ADHD have pointed out that except when they're in their area of special interest, then they're sort of super hyper-focused. So we begin to see that there's definitely a conflict going on here. Okay, so when we look at these gifted traits and misdiagnosis, something that really came together for us when we were first doing our investigation of this was Dr. Linda Silverman, again, who's an expert and one of the top researchers in giftedness, explained that you can sum up these characteristics of these individuals in 3 terms: intensity, sensitivity, and perfectionism. And when she said that, this light bulb sort of went on that was my entire family, absolutely. And what began to make sense to me was these characteristics are also the things that we see in many of these other labels that we look at. So what leads to these characteristics is also the issue of anxiety. Anxiety is something that's not often talked about as much as we believe it should be, because anxiety plays such a role in what happens when we see the intensity, sensitivity, and perfectionism that really tend to embrace the whole picture.
Yes, I want to speak a little bit more about anxiety because my whole family's fraught with it, but also I see so many of my students who either internalize their anxiety or they externalize it. And this aspect of anxiety can lead to behaviors that are often misperceived. The kids who tend to internalize it, they look like they will shut down in a classroom. They will shut down and they look like things are all right. They may not ask the questions they need to ask. Your children may not share what they need to share, so that they tend to be what I call the hypos. They kind of just are very quiet, and we think things are cruising along. The other side are the hypers, I call them. They tend to externalize their anxiety. That leads to the explosive behaviors that we see sometimes. It can lead to frustration. It can lead these kids to shut down as well. And a lot of times when we look at this anxiety, it manifests itself in obsessive thinking, that obsessive compulsive cycle of thoughts that starts chasing each other because the anxiety becomes so high it interferes with absolute functioning, and so the mind will get on that kick and just cycle around the what if, and it can lead from one thing to another. So as we look at our DSM system, we want to talk about why they're stuck, because ultimately our diagnostic system is where so many of our children are labeled, and so many of our children, the services that they receive either medically or in the classroom are determined by this DSM system. DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, and it's where we get the diagnoses that allow all the labels and insurance payments and therapies that are covered by various agencies and organizations. But when the DSM system came out, and I'm only going to start talking about from 1980 on, because that's when there was a big shift. And when this started in 1980, some aspects that were left out of this system that we believe highly impact our children are the fact that giftedness is often misunderstood. It is high IQ or special talent and high ability, and it's not been perceived or understood as a psychology. And as a result, the DSM system has created a vacuum for our bright, high-ability children who may have these overexcitabilities, but because giftedness isn't acknowledged in diagnostic criteria, because high ability is not acknowledged in diagnostic criteria, so clinicians aren't trained in the impact of IQ and how kids adapt their behavior based on IQ and how their experiences are qualitatively different because of IQ. So that when clinicians see children, they're not trained to understand the impact of overexcitabilities or high abilities. Instead, interestingly, the DSM only mentions in many of these diagnostic categories, it'll mention low intellectual disability or low functioning, but it won't acknowledge the high functioning in the diagnostic criteria. Those appear on what's called the different axes that the clinicians may or may not account for. So what this leads to is a system that confuses gifted behaviors, often sees them as challenges, diagnoses them as behavioral and mental disorders, when indeed what we're seeing are aspects of giftedness. And so we talk about this a lot in our book. We have a wonderful overview of the DSM. The chapter's title is The Layman's Guide to the DSM, and it charts the history and some of the challenges that this system has brought as a result of its emphasis on disability rather than including examining ability as well.
I'd like to move to the next slide, and because you just said it so well, so I think that slide represents what you were just talking about, and that is, as you mentioned, it's a chart that comes out of our book, Bright Not Broken, and where we laid down, so you can kind of get a visual of looking at each of these fields in their own kind of isolated capacity, which goes back to our goal of bridging the gap between these fields, because clinicians and educators are trained in each of these fields to see these traits through the lens of their area. And then when we begin to see that there's so much similarity of what's being described, we start understanding that maybe these things don't have the kind of natural cutoff points, or maybe we're each describing a different, if you've heard of the example, the parts of the elephant. We could be just describing them each from our own concept. And as Dr. Temple Grandin says, who wrote Bright Not Broken with us, one of our co-writers, she states very clearly we need to bust out of the silos, as she says, and start talking to one another and seeing that we are really discussing a lot of the same characteristics. So we've really got to look at it in this way. So moving to the next slide, we look at, we have a quote there from Dr. Lorna Wing, who is the expert who defined basically autism as a spectrum disorder. And Dr. Wing also defined Asperger's work. She translated Hans Asperger's work and gave us what we know of as Asperger's syndrome. So she says it very well, and that's what we're really summing up here. Nature never draws a line without smudging it a bit. So it leads us to the question of all of these multiple labels sometimes, and sometimes it can be overwhelming to parents as you discover new characteristics that are defined by a different discipline, and the next thing you know, you've got these alphabet soup labels we've heard them referred to, and we've called them ourselves. With your child, many labels going on because you're getting different interpretations of seeing different symptoms and different characteristics. Rebecca, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I want to add quickly is that it's important to understand, too, that it depends on the training the experts get as to whether a child's giftedness is recognized initially or whether things are often perceived as disabilities. So this works with educators as well, because I know as a teacher we receive more training in disabilities and challenging behaviors in the classroom, but are not given an explanation that may come out of a strengths-based explanation rather than a deficits-based explanation. So I just want people to understand that it depends upon how you're trained as to what you may see. Dr. James Webb, who is just one of the founding fathers of the modern view of giftedness, recognizes that there are social and emotional needs and differences of gifted individuals as well as intellectual differences. And on this slide, what I'd like to point out is that he raises some important questions, because oftentimes gifted children are misdiagnosed first as ADHD as having ADHD, but the symptom sets need to be questioned through a different lens, most notably that there are inconsistencies with developmental level. That could point to giftedness, or that if there's the asynchrony involved, we need to wonder whether the inattention or the impulsivity that is being witnessed occurs only in one or two environments, or is this more broad-based, which would indicate that there may be a challenge or a disability in action, whereas if it's more limited, then that might possibly point to the presence of giftedness that may be fueling these behaviors that are recognized as ADHD. And also the same with ODD, or oppositional defiant disorder. The power struggles that are often labeled as oppositional defiant disorder need to be viewed perhaps through the gifted lens, in the sense that are these coming from questions, curiosities, or are these behaviors coming from challenges with transitions and things? Really, it these labels impact how we see the child and how they see themselves. Are they curious and sensitive, or are we going to see them as oppositionally defiant? And so how we label them does have a huge impact.
And I would like to jump in here and just summarize kind of what we've been saying to this point in cutting through the confusion. It really is about clinicians and educators who are trained to assign labels to behaviors rather than looking at the whole child. It really does help us to get stuck. So as we just move through here quickly, let's go to the next slide and look at what's the solution to that. What do we do? Well, we look at things dimensionally, and just describing briefly what a dimensional model is. It creates a portrait, so the skills and strengths as well as charting a course for interventions and therapies. If we look at the whole picture, we're not just looking at the challenges and the disabilities. We're making sure that we understand the strengths and how those are perceived through giftedness. Rebecca, would you like to explain the DISCO briefly?
The DISCO is a tool. It's a diagnostic interview that was developed in the field of autism, but the interesting thing about it is it looks at multiple domains of functioning. It looks at attention. It looks at sensory, it looks at occupational functioning, it looks at behavioral, certain behaviors, it looks at moods, mood changes. They're all different domains that the DISCO looks at and examines so that we can get a better portrait of not does a child have this disorder or have this, or is a child gifted or not, or does the child have ADHD, but instead looking across what can this child do well, what can a child not do so well. This can guide therapies, interventions, not only for clinicians and parents, but ultimately depending upon diagnoses, because the DISCO is coded for diagnoses through ICD and DSM systems. Certain diagnoses, let me limit that, but also for educators as well. I do want to clarify, though, that the DISCO does not test for IQ. IQ testing is something that is an additional test, and it does not necessarily test for specific learning disabilities, although through the occupational interview it can indicate and recommend further, deeper testing if a certain label might be needed.
I just want to point out briefly, in an effort for us to help explain and to help get the idea of dimensional assessment going, it's what led us to our continuation of our work, and that is we are co-founders of the Bright Not Broken Lorna Wing Institute of America, where we will be bringing this instrument and the awareness of what a dimensional system is, hopefully very soon, to America, so that we can help keep the conversation going and really help this education, because we've got to start, and that goes back to the why they're stuck. We as parents need those providers who can best help us from that understanding. So we see our service as being able to offer that and to help also with parent awareness, so parents can have a clear picture of what all of these things are, how to understand, how to identify, and how to know the questions to ask their professionals. So just wanted to point that out, and we are really excited about this because there is a lot of talk in the professional world about dimensions, and it's a new term, so we're excited about getting that conversation going.
Yes, these are some of the pitfalls that our children face, and so it's pretty obvious. I'd like to move on to the next slide, because the whole child approach is really the best way to help twice exceptional children. The whole child model rests, first of all, on an accurate psychological portrait of a child's giftedness as well as their challenges, which is why the dimensional assessment is so important, because it's not just a disabilities label, but it's a functional challenge that a child may face. So that's why we're so adamant about the need for dimensional assessment, not just within a category in the DSM, but multiple across categories, so that all of the challenges in functioning can be identified early on, that development and developmental developmental stages as well as the degrees of impairment are accounted for, so that when a child comes into a classroom, we can, as teachers, look at what's going on. In addition, we need IQ testing that looks at discrepancies in performance. With Common Core comes something known as RTI, which is really posing a serious challenge for identifying twice exceptional children, because a lot of RTI rests upon data-driven performance that's generated, the data is generated in the classroom. The difference between a discrepancy test and an IQ, the discrepancy model is that as children are given IQ tests, we look for processing in subtests, and so that if there's a discrepancy in subtest domains, then we can see that this might indicate the presence of actual learning disability that's going on. Whereas in a classroom, if a teacher administers a test and a child shows proficient because a child's abilities, high abilities, are masking the disability, the child is less likely to be referred for testing or further intervention, and there we're missing the possibility for presence of specific learning disabilities and challenges. Best practices for twice exceptional, we know that we need gifted instruction in areas of strength. We also need support and strategies for areas where the executive function impairments, working memory, processing speed deficiencies are huge, because if a child appears slow because it's taking them longer to get to the deep question or to acknowledge the information that they need, that doesn't mean that they're a slow learner or that they are slow thinkers. It simply means that there's a processing speed issue perhaps that's going on. These children are often capable of wildly creative and abstract thinking, but it's masked because of a slow processing, so the child's misperceived as being a slow learner. Again, whole child approach will allow comprehensive case management, because if we look at, well, I just wanted for a second to say, if we look at the 504 being regarded as parents, if a child is regarded as having a challenge or disability, then they can receive those accommodations. And going back to the dimensional assessment tool, once it's identified that a child's functioning is challenged in a specific area, then the regarded as aspect of 504 law can play into the parent's favor for asking for further assessment in those areas rather than, and further supports in those areas, rather than simply having to wait for referral for specific learning disability testing. And by the way, parents also have that option to refer for disability testing. So to be successful, we need that complete portrait, that whole child, so that we can have a complete system of delivery that contains really two essential components. We have to understand the social and emotional needs and that children who are gifted and twice exceptional face because of asynchrony, because of unevenness in development and skills, because of peer challenges, because their peer groups are so different. So they have different social, emotional intensities, and they need social and emotional supports in a classroom. And a twice exceptional education program should also have a lot of strengths and interest-based accommodations. In fact, that's where our children will learn to shine. Rather than being defined by limitations, they can be defined by their strengths and abilities, and we can offer the supports for the challenges. And so if we go to educate in the areas of strengths and abilities, we're naturally going to go beyond the classroom. So it's up to parents oftentimes to look for areas of interest in nature, play, games. Look for what a child's naturally drawn to, because what a child chooses to do is a good indicator of what the child is very talented or their special interests are. Then we should nurture those areas of interest and broaden them beyond just a limitation. If, for instance, a child is interested in cars, don't just keep the interest on cars. Instead, go into parking lots, and if they're artistically inclined, have them not just draw cars, but parking lots, and eventually the buildings with the parking lots. This can lead, they can go into engineering, architecture. Just broadening these areas can help us see larger vocational areas that we can guide a child into. And then finally, developing gifts and talents. Project-based learning and mentors. The project-based learning and can lead to different peer groups. We're so lockstep in education by age group that really if we were allowed to students to join with project-based learning and work with mentors, their peer groups would shift. That'll improve their social abilities and also give them the confidence that they need. So this is the information where you can find us. We have our website for our institute at Bright Not Broken. Diane does a wonderful job of running the Twitter at Bright Not Broken, at Bright Not Broken Institute. And Diane, do you want to add anything else about our Facebook or?
I think we've summed it up pretty well. I'm excited to hear some of the questions for today's talk, and let's move forward.
Very good. There are plenty of them.
Okay.
Some of them sort of fall into the same category. One is my gifted son was denied services over and over because he was gifted. Then he was denied admission to a gifted program because he had ADHD and behavior problems. What is the parent to do?
Rebecca, would you like to answer that one from an educational standpoint?
Absolutely. The challenges are, honestly, a parent is kind of limited. Homeschooling might be an option for children who kind of fall between those cracks of the programs. The other thing as a parent I would do is seriously examine the philosophy behind the gifted education program that I was looking at, and also understand that as you're looking, private education may be the only avenue to take, because you need to go vet these schools, make sure that they understand these challenges in and out. But unfortunately, a lot of times those accommodations are not available in a public setting, and even in the private setting, parents have to do a lot of homework to find a good fit for their child.
A lot of people have asked, how do you find a provider who understands the 2E concept and can actually help the child?
Diane?
Oh, okay. Well, that I'm so glad someone asked that question, because you have validated what we are working so desperately to do, and that is to hopefully be able to spread this awareness in education so that that's more readily available. In the meantime, I would encourage you to seek out those professionals that may be part of your school team or your psychologist might be able to recommend. Somebody who understands. You want to look at people who do understand the gifted piece of this, because that tends to be an easier understanding than coming at it strictly from disability, where you've not been exposed to the strength side and to be able to see these two things together. So we would encourage, as we continue this conversation, that is really one of our needs, to get this information going. It's what we hope to do by bringing the dimensional assessment tool, DISCO, here through our institute, because we will be providing awareness trainings for parents and professionals on the importance of this information, and we'll be going to in the educational field as well to help expand this conversation. We'll be offering a network and a resource through our institute, which will hopefully connect as these clinicians are certified in this tool. It will begin to be more widespread. But right now, for some right now answers, I would say try to ask for somebody who might have experience in giftedness. We also have resources on our website, Bright Not Broken Institute, as well.
Mm-hmm. And that was going to be my recommendation, is go to our website. We have clinicians who are extremely who are the experts in twice exceptionality. So I would encourage you to explore that and start there.
Yes, a parent asks, my gifted second grader with ADHD struggles with writing. It seems like most testing is geared toward reading and math, where he does great. I know ADHD is another health impairment under IDAA. Does dyspraxia, dysgraphia qualify as a specific learning disability?
Yes, it does, and as a matter of, those do qualify for specific learning disabilities. But what you may be running up against, and going back to what I was saying in the presentation about RTI, and I don't know if your system's on Common Core, but as we look for data-driven referrals for testing, I don't know how your school in particular recommends for testing, but as a parent under law, you have the right to request that testing. OHI accommodations will not, as you've said, will not help your second grader. They won't help anyone with a specific learning disability in terms of it, supporting that disability. But with RTI, unless there is significant discrepancy between the data and the child's ability level in the class, is shown in the classroom, then the testing won't occur unless you request it. If that's the, if indeed you're under Common Core. So.
Mm-hmm. Does the school pay for tests to determine a child's giftedness, or does the parent have to pay for it?
Schools will pay for that as part of the referral system. If there's a challenge, yes, schools will do the screening tests and they will go deeper. The thing about it is, and I just want people to understand that not all IQ tests are administered equally. A lot of it depends on the training and the rules that are in play. If you go to someplace like, say, the Gifted Development Center in Colorado, who truly understands giftedness, IQ tests have something called cutoffs. And so after a child misses so many questions in sequence, let's say they missed 3, that's the cutoff, and that's the measurement that's used in that domain, and that subtest, and that's their score. But what experts in giftedness have found is that children who have hidden disabilities or who are profoundly gifted and highly gifted but are challenged in areas, if they go ahead and ask questions, if the tester goes ahead and asks questions beyond the cutoff point, they will discover that the child is able to do the abstract thinking, whereas the lower skills may be more, or questions may be based upon some processing skills. The higher questions may reveal a deeper level of abstract thinking that indicates the presence of much higher IQ. So while schools will test based upon teacher recommendation, please understand that if you suspect that your child, if you don't get the result that you think describes your child, you may have to go for private testing, because there again, not all IQ tests are administered the same or dependent upon guidelines.
Yes, how does a parent recognize signs of giftedness in a young child at home, let's say? I know you sort of touched on that, but a lot of parents have asked that question.
One of the things we mentioned was this early development of looking at, and I know for me, my son Sam was a very early talker. So, and what I mean by that is completing full sentences before he was 2, but it was his curiosity. It wasn't just the language. I mean, of course, I noted right away that he was speaking very clearly, but it was his level of curiosity. I would say asking questions in the curiosity level with these children, and also the ability to grasp concepts at a rapid pace. That is a clear sign of early development. It's where these children move a little bit quicker, and they move at a super rate when it's an area of interest to them, which is where we kind of see their area of interest early on. If we go back and look, they tend to be very passionate, and it's like the more passionate they are, the faster they learn, and then we start recognizing that they are learning way ahead of their peers, the rate of how they process information.
But the rate of processing, and if you don't mind if I jump in, because I have 2 twice exceptional children, and one, the gifts were obvious initially in terms of he was in terms of overexcitabilities. He was running by the time he was eight months old. He was full on running, not walking. And his artistic talents were coming in highly verbal. My daughter, on the other hand, she grasped concepts, and it was obvious that she understood them, but her verbal abilities in terms of being able to, you could see the information, but her processing was slower. And so for her, I saw the disabilities along with the giftedness. And as I watched, it became, as she developed, it seemed like some of the disabilities, the processing speed was, and the dyslexia came into being, and central auditory processing almost overshadowed the giftedness for a little while. The inquisitiveness, the curiosity was there, but the processing challenges became more obvious. So even though I want parents to understand there's a lot of precociousness, you can also see signs of disability very early on when you see that precociousness and you see that they're having challenges with the processing. So the processing speed may also be an indicator, even though they're working in their areas in that perplexity. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Next question.
Well, hold
sorry,
on.
Diane.
No, that's okay. Let me jump in here and add there. That's an important thing. And for anyone that was a new term for you today, the asynchronous development. We briefly touched on that, but it's really important. That's another key sign about giftedness. And what we mean by asynchrony is the ability to have some of these rapidly developing abilities. At the same time, it's like the polar effect, the polar opposite effect. At the same time, we see that their difficulties are sort of going against the tide. So it's not smooth. Asynchronous to me means it's not smooth. You've got two opposing forces going in different directions. And Dr. Linda Silverman, that we pointed out today, also makes an astute observation where she says a lot of times the more asynchronous a child is, the higher the giftedness and the deeper the disability. It makes sense that those two things go in both directions. So if it happens to be you're seeing intensely first the disability, you might quickly recognize at the same time, which is perplexing, is the rapidness of the development of the gift. So that's the asynchrony and the asynchronous development. That's really important to watch for.
And the other thing I want to throw in here, because this goes along with it, is that unevenness of skills. As a child hits the school age, when we as teachers start seeing children who can do something one day and is unable to do it the next, that unevenness is also an indicator, perhaps not that they're lazy that day and not that they're trying, because those are the labels that they're typically given. Oh, you're just being lazy, and you could do this yesterday. Why aren't you doing it today? And you just don't want to do it, and you know what, you're just being stubborn. Those kinds of, that unevenness can lead to a lot of misperceptions. So please be aware that asynchrony and unevenness is particularly, both of those areas are very challenging for parents and educators and clinicians all around, because that unevenness is also a sign of high ability, but also the presence of disability.
One mother asks, my son is now 15, and his gifts have been overlooked for so long in school that I think he has lost them. I heard that 2E students can become increasingly frustrated that the people around them believe that they don't get it, when in reality they do get it and have lots to say about it, but no one will listen because their ADHD issues have clouded the perception of them. After years and years of this, my son simply starts to fold. Would you speak to this? Is this common?
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's where the title of our book came from, is Bright Not Broken, because when finally Diane's son, whose disabilities really interfered with his progress, and also my daughter's challenges really interfered. What happened was both of them became determined that they were going to be seen as bright rather than bright rather than broken. When we focus so much on a child's challenges, I think your son may be, or your 15-year-old may be a perfect example of how we can frustrate children and harm them, because the frustration comes in that they may actually know what we're accusing them of not knowing. Their processing issues, executive function, working memory, may not allow them to express that. And that's why putting them in their area of strength early on is so important. But once they turn 15, 16, it's not too late. It's really never too late to develop a sense of who we are through our abilities and talents. In fact, that's going to be where your son or daughter gets their validation, is through their abilities. That's where they're going to learn to function and have a more positive life outcome in adulthood. That's where they're going to meet people who can share their interests and value them for what they can do and who they are and what they know in their area, and not look at them as being limited or less than because they're not fitting in with the norm. Diane, what do you want to say about it?
No, I would totally agree with that. In that, I was reminded of one of our wonderful members on our professional advisory board, Dr. James Webb, who's a gifted expert. He wrote a book about existential depression, and he talks about their deep need, because these individuals are all about their purpose and knowing why they exist. And when they are so beat up, and by 15, even though that seems like a young age, they've known since they were tiny, tiny individuals that they know what they know, but yet their struggle about swimming upstream trying to relate to the world can really take a toll. And I would encourage our listeners here today to investigate that. And our website has links to some of these great resources, but that's a wonderful book, and I think we've done a podcast on that specific subject as well about his book. But that's an important issue, because depression becomes a natural byproduct of feeling your whole life like you're swimming upstream. So it's really important, because you also not only get understood, but I would encourage you to reach out to some parent groups. And saying Supporting Emotional Needs of the Gifted has wonderful parent groups throughout the country, and relate to other parents. Have your child be able to get involved in other activities and groups with people who are like him, because when we get around people, we realize we're not alone, and that in itself can be so supportive and so helpful.
A lot of parents have asked about IEPs and 504 plans. Schools, teachers, etc. Tend to fight them because they have this gifted quality, and yet they struggle in other areas. There are parents who want to know how they can advocate for their child. Do you have any practical strategies for them to successfully get an IEP or 504 plan when the child is gifted?
I think, Rebecca, you definitely should take this, since you are an educator in the public school system, so you've had experience dealing with this issue.
Well, the first issue rests on proper identification, which is part and parcel of our mission. And that's why proper identification of the challenges across multiple domains of functioning is so important. Because in our education system, without the labels, our children tend not to be recognized as having needs. That being said, 504 did make specific accommodations that if a child is regarded as having a disability, then they are entitled to having supports for that. That means if a child is regarded as having a challenge with writing, then if indeed you can document that the child's regarded, and that does not necessarily mean by having the label, but again, this comes back to the importance of dimensionally looking at a child. If you have a child who can demonstrably in class verbally pass a test, but cannot write the paragraph, then you know you have an indicator of a processing issue. So parents do have some leeway in terms of if regarded as and you know what you're dealing with, you can go and say, look, we both know his handwriting or her handwriting is atrocious. We need some support for this. At the same time, it's very, very important that your teacher's on board with it and getting the teacher to understand the accommodations that are necessary and that are effective. Because I'll be honest with you, in teacher education, there is limited and inconsistent instruction from program to program across the universities in giftedness. And the same holds true with disabilities. There's a lot more awareness of disabilities because there's been a lot more advocacy efforts. So getting a teacher to believe that a child who is challenged but who is gifted isn't just being stubborn because they're failing to perform on a consistent level or they're being lazy, and getting that teacher to go back to get the accommodations is a challenge. But if you can educate the teacher, if you can talk to the teacher and get them on your side, they may indeed be able to go to administration, go to the psychologist, get some form of assessment done, because again, you have every right to work with the teacher, but you also have a right to demand it. I mean, under law, parents have every right to demand this. The problem is the giftedness often will mask some of the cutoffs for educational interventions. And so that's why it's really important for parents to understand that, schools operate by their cutoffs, and sometimes parents don't have any choice but to go out and get other supports. Or if indeed you do have an IEP or you don't have an IEP but you have this profile of functioning that the schools can't support, then federal law mandates that the states will have to pay for that private education in order for you to access the services to help your child get the education that he or she needs. They don't want to do it. You're going to have to go to bat, and I mean, oftentimes it results in court battles. But I think a parent's strongest leg to stand on right now is 504 in terms of they can insist that they have the right to request it. But as far as specific strategies, and in IEP meetings, I'll tell you the biggest thing you can do is educate your IEP, your support team right there about giftedness, about asynchrony, about unevenness in skills, and the fact that your child may indeed be experiencing this. And if they're also regarded as talented in other areas, perhaps you can bring that in.
And can I add just one quick thing there to that very point, is many of the resources that we point to, again, our professional advisory board, they offer some of these services, and it may be difficult for you to get to their locations, such as the Summit Center in California with Dr. Dan Peters and Susan Daniels, or the Gifted Development Center, Linda Silverman in Denver. Many of them list a lot of these resources on their website. They provide services to help you with advocacy and intervention in these areas. So I would refer to these experts who offer some of these services.
The other thing is there's a really excellent book. The author's last name is Bachman-Cullen. I think it's Jennifer who wrote this, Diane, but it's called IEP from A to Z. And she's a speech-language pathologist, and I think she and her mother, Diane, collaborated on it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But that book lines out, and speech-language pathologists who understand these twice exceptional kids oftentimes will be your best friend because they understand some of these hidden social challenges that kids are facing. And please understand, when we talk about these hidden challenges, your speech-language pathologist will be the one who's in the know to understand that the abstract thinking, like the ability to infer while reading, or the ability to read social cues and understand facial expressions and tones of voice, those subtle challenges that our kids sometimes face make a world of difference in achievement. And so in their ability for reading comprehension in particular, which is a whole nother issue. But I'm going to encourage you, parents, to look at IEP from A to Z, because that is a a wonderful guide on how to navigate the system for kids who do have higher abilities as well.
Well, I think we'll have to end it there. Thanks, Diane and Rebecca, for helping all of us navigate the 2E maze. I think we have the makings of a game plan for helping our twice exceptional kids now. So thank you so much for your rich presentation and information.
I'd like to say thank you so much for having us. We're excited to have this conversation and obviously to keep it going. And we would invite you to visit us at our website at brightnotbrokeninstitute.com and also have a conversation with us on Twitter and Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you so much.
Very good. Thanks again. Once again, this webinar is sponsored by Camp Sequoia, focused on the unique talents of twice exceptional young men, directed by Brian Lux, and based upon his research presented at the World Gifted Conference. Camp Sequoia empowers success in young men through innovative and dynamic programs. From 3D printing and astronomy to traditional campfires, art, and sports, Camp Sequoia provides individual attention to bring out the best in all of their campers. Campers enjoy air-conditioned, semi-private lodging, lounges, and the 2-to-5 staffing ratio for their summer of fun. You can visit Camp Sequoia online at www.camp-sequoia.com. We'll see you next week, everyone. Have a good day.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.